So I'll give an overview of the final bits on we wrote a report on the intelligent policy management, a gap analysis document, which is looking at the use of policies and the relationship of MEF and TMF and IETF. So this was done by John Strassner. It was a foundation to the architecture work on. It was a critical piece of work on the. Where's the red light on? Oh, there it is. The experiential network intelligence context. So we're looking at situational awareness. The work item analysed the work done in various SDOs on network policy management in general. I mean, we're looking mainly at the free work. I will move on to. We analysed as an introduction, the analyse of the MEF PDO model, which there was a bigger description on a few days ago. There was analysis of the IETF SUPRA model, analysis of the TMF Forum SID model, which is the Service Independent Framework Policy model. And it looked at these three models. And basically it fitted around these 5 layers in the architecture. And in the lower layer we have in the traditional imperative-based policy models. In the middle layers we have the declarative-based policy models that are being worked on in SUPRA. And at the higher level we will have the intent-based policy model that's being worked on in MEF. And we want to extend the intent-based policy model to mean the description is more based around the business view, around the SLAs and processes, and moving down to the service view at the worst case. We don't want to abstract the lower layers. We want the AI to have a knowledge of how to abstract down to the lower layers. So we want to describe the policies at the higher layer. That's where we want to move towards. So that was, in summary, the result of the report that was written, is that we want to move up in the policy model towards the imperative, from the imperative through the declarative, but towards the intent-based policy models in the higher layer. So we want to move to the intent-based policy model that's described briefly on this slide, which is describing where you want to get to in the bright yellow boxes, the bright green boxes. I can press this hard enough here. So this is describing what you want to do at a business level. So it's letting the artificial intelligence specify how the network is going to operate on a day-to-day basis, on a service deployment basis, to make it more efficient in the future of a very complex virtual deployment and near real-time redeployment of services. So this report is in the publications trail at the moment, so it's in the tube of Etsi publications. So we've just started this architecture document, and John Strassner is one of the editors, and Fred Fuselin from Verizon is the rapporteur. And Intel have a critical role in helping to co-edit this as well. So we aim to be as open to new members as possible. So what's the purpose of this? Well, it's just started, and the scope is to define the functions and interactions that specify the ENI requirements. Define the architecture in the terms of functional blocks. It's a functional block architecture like the MEF architectures. And to define reference points in the above functional blocks. So that's the goal, is to define functional blocks and define the reference points. So far we have got to this high-level description, and we've got a context-aware management, a situational-aware management, policy-based management, cognition framework, and knowledge-based representation and management. So a few words on each of these. I'll just pick a few words out of each of these slides. The knowledge-based representation and management functional block is looking at taking the knowledge out of the AI and applying that knowledge framework to each of the systems. So it's fundamental to the disciplines of modeling AI. It also enables machine learning and reasoning without a formal consensual representation of the knowledge. So we don't have to understand each piece of data. We just want to extract the knowledge from the data, how the behavior is going on, things which are becoming less used, things that are becoming more used, when the time is critical to turn something on, For instance, those kind of issues about what needs to change in the near future, what needs to change either up or down in the network to change the use of resources, to make resources cheaper when they're not needed, to make resources ready to be used when they are needed. So the context-aware management functional block is to describe the state and environment which an entity exists or has existed. Now this is looking at the context of the system. It's looking at what's existed in the near future or in the near past. The near future is specified by a time schedule. The near future isn't looking at a crystal ball. So that's how this is looking at the context awareness. And that's the SLA requirements are specified into here. The situational awareness is looking at what's going on presently in the network. Are resources available to be switched on? Do we have enough resources? Do we have faults in the network? Do we have things that need to be sort of rerouted to allow things to be brought in? The perception of the data behavior. So we have to reap the data from around the network to understand the situation that is existing in real time. So this is what's happening now. This one is the context aware is the state that is historically happened or expecting to happen according to a schedule in the near future. So the policy-based model is how we apply the policies to those two things, what policies we put over the situation as it is now. I mean, there may be critical services which take priority. There may be an earthquake in one part of the world. There may be an earthquake in the UK the other week, but it wasn't that serious to require any telecoms adjustment. But it was very minor. So I know people in the UK were quite frightened, but I've been in more major earthquakes, unfortunately. Yeah. So, I mean, there are events that happen in the world which will require things to change. Like, it could be a major road incident which requires certain things to be redirected or changed. So those policies will need to be applied in a much more creative way, using the artificial intelligence to understand the policy, the situation and the context, whether the context is historical and near future planning, scheduling. So you need to put those three together to work out what to do next or what's going to happen. So we have the cognition management, which is looking at the tools of artificial intelligence, the tools of how you change an existing knowledge, of how you perform interfaces about how you ingest information, how you collect the information, how you use raw data, how you infer from the data, how you use historical data, how you understand historical data, how you extract information from the historical data, how you move from the pure data to the knowledge and to the information and hence the knowledge and in future to the wisdom. So these are the ideas that we are going to work with in these knowledge representations, in the context aware, in the situational awareness, in the policy management and the cognition framework. So this is really a toolbox. This is the policies, the SLA policies, the policies which are set up by the network operator. This is the situation that you find in the network. This is the context that you either know from history or you know from the scheduling. And this is the knowledge representation. This is how the data is put together and managed. So this is how it's all this is shown alongside, because it takes data out of one place and puts it into another and uses the tools from the toolbox so it begins to build on each of the things that comes out of these blocks. And there's also a bus to actually move the data around, but that's not shown in this diagram. Okay, so that highlights. Now, in the proof of concepts, the goal of proof of concepts is, from the ISG perspective, is to get contribution. The goal of proof of concepts and the proof of concept team is to get a demonstration at the bottom. And when the demonstration is actually achieved, they end the proof of concept. Well, they may go on to a more complex proof of concept or to some kind of wider open source situation. The proof of concept review team, its simple goal is to interface the two, is to be a go-between, and to review that the scope of the proof of concepts proposals from the proof of concept teams fits into the ISG the ISG terms of reference, and to evaluate the progress is being made, and to give them the room to make contribution into the work items of the ISG, and then to evaluate their output, look at the demos, and to, well, let them close. I guess some of the teams will want to go around and do it again, but the aim of companies is probably to have a great show to show that the proof, their situation works well. Okay, so that's briefly what the proof of concept's about. Now, whether this happens in 3 months or 9 months, I suspect to have a real situation of this, it's probably going to take slightly longer than 3 months. But it would be good if this can happen at a reasonable pace. So the next meeting is held by Telecom Italia in R&D in Turin, Italy. Everyone is welcome to come, but I would like active people. If we have lots of guests, then they will be guests. They will be okay. Members are entitled to contribute. Guests are entitled to watch and speak when they're asked to speak. The expected future issues. The expectation is that we're going to start work on this version 2 in the near future. And we're going to accept updates to version 1 because we've had several new members fairly recently, so we don't expect to close the work items. So we expect to publish something, publish what we've got, but then continue refining the use cases and requirements as we refine the architecture. The second is development of the system architecture, possible reuse of existing APIs, intent policies and AI tools. Establishment of POCs, contribution of assurance of and validation of the system architecture. From the ISG's perspective, the main goal of the POCs is to assure and validate the system architecture and to contribute to it. From the POC itself, the goal of the company is to produce something that works and to advertise that it works. I mean, I guess ultimately our goals are the same. Standardize how network experience is measured, that's in the near future. And we welcome new members. All ISGs are open to new members. As I say, 6 months ago, last summer, we had about 14 members. Today, we've got 28, 30 members, depending how you count it. And we are growing. We don't aim to be the biggest group, but that's not the aim. We aim to produce something, and we aim to work together with other organizations like NFV, like ZSM, MEC, to work together to each produce work in our area and our scope. Thank you. Any questions? I can't see your face, there's a light in my eyes.
You're not losing that much.
Okay.
So, hi, Krzysztof Korzynowicz, Datacon. I have a question because a lot of the stuff that you're talking about in intent, this is also like a certain view on the requirements and also the possibility of testing that against the network. Are you looking at that from some point? Because you're talking about the usage of that in AI, I understand that, but it's also, it could be used also for the initial statement of whether this is actually doing the stuff that it's supposed to be doing. So like for requirements management.
I think we need to specify it first before we test it. But yes, I think we should test it and make sure it works. Yeah. So I think, the goal of the POCs is to test it in the short term. The goal of the committee should be to test it shortly after. So there needs to be some testing work items, some validation work items that follow on. I mean, I'm not suggesting that our work is going to close and finish. Testing, I think, would be logically the next phase of the work. Yeah. Okay. Okay.
So what I'm asking about is that at the moment, at least where I am, I'm working on a continuous integration pipeline for a sensible, and the biggest thing that I'm missing at the moment is for a telco service, continuous integration pipeline for a telco service. The thing that we are missing the most is a sensible business language to describe a service. So we can use, we are trying to use behavior descriptions, so that's actually very similar to the stuff that, I mean, I don't know if you know behavior descriptions, that is something that would be very similar to the intent policies, like the top level ones.
Makes sense.
Huh?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yes, and we are trying to do that, but this is not that easy because you can maybe do it once for relatively simple services. The moment you start mixing services and like multiple layers of networks get involved, this is simply not that easy. And I was simply wondering whether you're also like, what are the uses of on the intent policies? Whether you're going to try to translate between them, for example, and like for me that framework actually is fascinating. So.
Well, thank you for your question. I mean, first of all, I think you're correct. I think it's slightly different words, but there is a lot of relationship between the intent-based policies and the business relationship and the business description of services. And are we going to specify a validation of the services and a validation language for the services? Well, if people contribute in their documents, then I would imagine what is today a single architecture document could actually spawn several other documents, and those documents could be written very quickly. I believe the reason new members have joined is to specify this intent-based policies much more clearly, and I mean, they've joined this week, and I mean, I can't crystal ball gaze and say what they're going to do next week, but from private conversations I've had with them, that may be one of the issues they want to bring. I would ask them to be rapporteur for that item, but that's the way I work as chairman. People don't get away scot-free. They simply, if they say something, they get asked to do something. Yeah. Okay. That doesn't answer your question. It says kind of, yes, but please come and contribute. Or work with someone else that's contributed. I'm not forcing people to be a member. That's not my goal.
Dave Mullum, TM Forum. You mentioned function blocks, and the last question was actually about services. So I wondered whether you considered more of a service-orientated approach to this rather than the function block approach.
Is that a question to me or to the previous speaker?
No, to you. Okay, because you've mentioned a lot about a functional block-based architecture, but the last question was about services, which is a slightly different view of the world. So services are exposed, and the functionality that's exposed is defined in the exposed service. Whereas in a function block architecture, you know the context because you know what's at the other end. Whereas in a service-based architecture, you don't, which is the point that you were raising about composition. You know, you need to build things so that you don't know how they're going to be used at the next level. I wonder whether that had been considered at all in the discussions.
We haven't yet had those discussions, so I think it's a valid point. I mean, TMF invited us to a meeting in a couple of weeks' time, but I only got the invitation last night. So,
okay, so I haven't seen that yet. But
you may not have seen that either. So.
But we probably would be interested in having a conversation about that. Just the point about the expressing the services and the constraints and the behaviour, we have been experimenting in the TMF with the use of a form of EBNF to describe that behaviour. I'd say we're at a fairly early stage yet, but the interesting thing about EBNF is that most languages are capable of being expressed in EBF. And if you're going to get up with a restricted language in EBNF, you can probably map those to the internal representations, which was the point you raised on your slide. The difference between your slide was that imperative, declarative. The difference between declarative and intent is the fact that you translate from an external view to an internal view. Yes. It was a slide down. If you look at your definition of intent and a declarative-based, it was the three definitions on a slide. It's much later.
Later?
This one, well, you've just gone past it. That one there, the difference between an intent policy and a declarative policy is in the final sentence about it. It states that each statement in an intent policy may require translation of one or more of its terms to a form that another managed functionality entity can understand. So it implies a translation from an external to an internal view.
It says mapping, I think, yeah. But
Mapping,
it's
sorry.
the same thing, yeah. Well, a similar thing. Mapping maybe is
That's the
slightly-
point about EBNF, is that you can use it as a basis of translation.
Yes, I mean, we need to define service framework and intent policies for the services, and that needs to be defined in an infrastructure and imperative policy independent way, because we don't know how those services are going to be used. We don't know what network resources may be available at the time, and some of the services hopefully will be available, but in certain conditions only part of the service might be available. So you need to know whether the whole service is blocked or whether only part of it gets blocked. You need to start to define what happens in these policy situations. I don't know the answer to these questions, but because we've not had the discussion yet, and not because I'm trying to avoid the answer. But, I mean, they could be useful. I'm not committed to a particular language until we've had the discussion, because... but
The only point about EBNF is it's often the way in which you express the capability of
the gap analysis simply looked at some of the issues and it compared each of these models. And that SID is not the only model from TMF. There are other models as well, which... So the question is...
So we probably need to take this off the main discussion, but there are other pieces of work we've done other than the SID policy model that are relevant to this discussion, and I'll have that discussion with you afterwards.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I can't see because the light is in my eyes.
I am Ken from NTT.
Yeah.
On the ecosystem page, I see a lot of architecture-related organizations, right? But I don't see what kind of detailed activities are going on about the architecture liaisons. So could you give me some example of our activities or what's going on?
On liaisons, some of the liaisons have been... well, liaisons with standards bodies are documentation liaisons that we've started. Liaisons with industry bodies, we've given presentations at the industry bodies. Liaisons with open source, I think at the moment we've not gone very far down that route. So 3GPP and IETF, we've started to talk to them in terms of documentation and past liaisons backwards and forwards. IETF and MEF, we've researched some of their architectures and models, but there's not been a lot of documents passed backwards and forwards until we have some stable documentation. Because the Etsi policy is that we shouldn't give too much away until we know what we're talking about. So, yeah, I think the answer is we're starting to do the liaisons. We have liaisons with all these... We have the intent to liaise with all the standards groups. We have intent to liaise with the Linux Foundation ONAP, but we haven't created a great deal of liaison with that apart from internal discussion within the companies. We have had internal discussion within the companies. I have given presentations at SDNIA and AIAN in China, and I've given presentations at the ITUT, and I give them presentations, yeah. And next week I'm giving a presentation at BBF. But beyond, that's the start of a liaison process, I believe.
All right. Thanks for sharing the situation. Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, Main.
Yeah.
I'm Zlatko Dukic from Deutsche Telekom. Basically, AI systems are based on the input data. Do you plan to formalize the process of data acquisition? Because that seems to be one of the problems, I would say. If you understand what I mean. So, will you make any kind of formalization or specification that the vendors could, let's say, follow in order to provide the data for such systems?
We plan to reuse the API or define payloads on the APIs for these data reaping, so where data is reaped from different parts of the network. When related to legacy networks, it's difficult to know exactly what data can be collected. I mean, when related to MAMO, it's fairly direct, as we discussed here, and related to LSO architecture. So yes is the answer. On some of these interfaces, we do plan to develop the payloads over the APIs. We don't necessarily need, or we don't expect to develop new APIs, but we do expect to reap data, whether we can reap the data using existing APIs and just specifying what data payloads we want to take, we want to get. We will need copies of data going around the network because, as you say, the AI is based upon its analysis of the data. Going beyond that, it's not the goal of the group to define new interfaces. It's the goal of the group to define the fact it wants the data in its current format. So will that tell manufacturers how they can develop interfaces, how they can provide? Well, it depends what manufacturers want to make that interface. If manufacturers want to develop that interface, yes, operators can specify that they will want, if a standard interface is developed, operators can point to that standard in their procurement exercise and say, we want that.
Okay, thank you. I mean, just to be very precise, let's say that one of the applications of AI systems would be in the live system to constantly monitor what is happening, and in case of any kind of problem, now we would like this artificial system to solve our issue very quickly. When I say solve issue, it means to identify what is wrong, to give some hints what should be done, and maybe in the future to do it if it's autonomous system. So if we want to achieve something like that, then yeah, obviously we will need some kind of
This is exactly what we're trying to do here. Yeah.
But so I'm saying for this use case and for probably all the rest, we would really need to get some kind of, let's say, standardized form of acquiring the data. Because if any provider would do it in a different way, then we could run into issues. And that was the ground of my question. So thank you for the answer. So
basically, I agree with you, but I can't predict that other manufacturers will give you that data. I can predict that we will try to specify something, and we want as many manufacturers and operators on board to make that specification as open and reasonable as possible.
Yeah, but I meant since you are defining some kind of framework, how it should look like, where things should fit in, then one of those definitions could also be in the way how to acquire data or maybe try to standardize.
Yes.
But, okay, I get it now. Thank you.
Yeah, it's got a red light flashing, time's up. Okay. If there are no more questions, time's up, so we can close. I don't know if Layer 123 want to say something to close the session. Just want to close here. Okay, thank you.